Good morning, everyone. We're delighted to have this third seminar of the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group, and we're very happy to have Nicole Roughan, who is joining us from Auckland, New Zealand. It's pretty late there, so thanks so much, Nicole, for this. And it's great to have you. And just before we start, do know that this meeting is being recorded, so we will upload the session to our YouTube video, but it's only the presentation, so we will not record the Q&A, and that's important for you to know. We will stop by 11:30, so we will have around an hour and 30 minutes to present for you, Nicole, 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Now, in Q&A, if you want to make a question, please write your question privately to me. So that's the ideal thing, instead of the chat box, okay? So basically, you can go to chat box and you can look my name, and it'll pop up the option, just write private message to me, and I'll pass it along to Nicole. So, well, I'll leave it to you, Nicole. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that I have a bit of a handout. Oops, sorry about this. I've just done the wrong one. You would think that we would all be experts on screen share by now, but obviously not. Just a moment. I'll just get that working again. For some reason. There we go. Okay, this time it's working. Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. What I intend to do is speak to the paper for 30 minutes or so. I'm going to try and sort of judge how much of the background work I'll need to cover versus how much I can skip through. But I won't assume that everybody's read the paper. Obviously, it's quite a long paper, for which I sort of apologize, but I'm also aware that it's trying to cover a lot of material. So as many times as I've tried to cut it down, it's still getting away from me a bit on the length. So the paper tackles what in many ways is an old question, right? It's this old question about what is practical authority, and in particular, under what conditions can it be justified? So it's a question, obviously, that leading Oxford figures have been working on for far longer than I have, and I guess in a way we might wonder what more could there be to say about this topic or to say about this question. So the way I come at this question is with a concern that all of the work that does sort of tease it out, does challenge ideas about the justification of authority, tends to divide between either focusing upon reasons in a sort of a Razian account, or focusing on relations between persons, relations between authorities and subjects. And these are typically presented or typically articulated and argued as alternatives. And in earlier work that I've done on authority, I've tried to build an argument that shows that that authority is both a matter of reasons and relations, and that these are together elements of the very idea of authority, which also mean that we need a justification that speaks to both, i.e. that the justification for authority must not only be about a matter of reasons, but must also be a matter between persons. And in the earlier work that I've done on this sort of conjunctive approach to authority, I've simply put them together. I had simply lumped them together as if they could sit as easy bedfellows. And of course, as often happens in our work, the more we work on it, the more we think about it, we realize all the mistakes that we've made. And so I now think that reasons and relations are not easy, comfortable, happy bedfellows. Instead, they can sit together, they can operate together, but that takes some further explanation. And that's where this idea of recognition comes in. So what I'm going to do is set up a little bit of my sort of introductory overall claim around recognition and authority. Do that through a little bit of background work on on the idea of authority and indeed its justification. So to try to do a little bit of that catch up work, but then to really focus and zero in on what recognition does to the accountable authority and how it helps these elements of authority and elements of the justification of authority sit together and adhere. So what I argue then, and what I will argue in the presentation and what is set out in the paper, is that there are two features of authority, or two elements of authority, one being this element of reasons, the other being this element which I will call relations. But the key to these elements is that they are, on the one hand, normative, and on the other hand, social. And so the justification of authority has to attend to both of those elements. What I argue is that it does so through practices of recognition between persons, but also recognition of institutional roles. And these are two different kinds of practices of recognition, which both do the same work in a justification of authority. In both cases, recognition is understood as a practice, a social collective practice or an interpersonal practice, which responds to value. And what it does in responding to value, I argue, is transmits value and transmits normativity between authorities and subjects. So the overall claim then is that recognition has an instrumental contribution to make to the justification of authority, but it's instrumental in a particular way. So what recognition does is connects the authority and the subject to one another. That is, it connects the persons to one another, connects the roles to one another, and indeed connects the reasons applying to those persons to one another. So recognition then operates as a kind of a connective, a connective glue to adhere authority's normativity and its sociality. But it also, and perhaps a different metaphor, perhaps I'm mixing my metaphors now, but it also operates as what I call a cog. That is, that there is value and social relationships that are connected together and indeed transmitted between the authority and subject through the practice of recognition. So that's the sort of end point of where the paper gets to, but what I want to do is work my way up to defend that position. In order to do that, I want to start with a few quick distinctions about recognition and the idea of recognition as it comes to us from a number of different literatures, some of which I pull together and pull out in the paper, but which themselves are just sort of scratching the surface of a much broader set of ideas that come from work in social ontology, come from work in ethics, come from work in critical political theory. And what I do with the idea of recognition is try to enrich what I take to be a fairly bare or fairly descriptive understanding of the way in which recognition is often thought to work in more analytic discussions of theories of authority. So in some of the more analytic discussions, we see a lot of argument which is quite dismissive of the idea of recognition, or at least takes it for granted in a descriptive way. So it's fairly commonplace then to think that some kind of recognition, just as bare identification or bare kind of cognition, is indeed important to the very existence of authority, because without some sense that that authority is recognized, or that there is identification of a claimant of authority, then you couldn't have authority at all. That much is certainly clear from Erasian accountable authority, and indeed seems to be fairly well accepted. But there's much more to ideas of recognition than just that bare cognitive or descriptive sense in which authority is identified. So what we see in some of the other literatures on recognition is the development and the articulation and the defense of a much more robust idea of recognition as a matter of interpersonal practice, which goes in some cases to the very idea of personhood, which goes in some cases to the idea of interpersonal moral obligations, or which goes to the idea of recognition of the value of social institutions. And it's those ideas of robust recognition whether it's in the interpersonal sense of what is owed between persons directly to one another in their direct relations, or the robust sense of what is owed between persons in respect of the roles that they occupy, the recognized roles that they occupy, which I think feed into an account of authority. So then I start by really just setting up that sort of quite important and not fully defended yet distinction that I've made in the paper between bare or cognitive recognition and a more robust normative sense of recognition. So that's the first sort of key distinction. The second key distinction is about the really important difference between claiming and receiving authority. So I think when we talk about recognition and authority, when we put those ideas together, the literature very often uses the idea of recognition of authority as being something that happens on the subject side of the equation, right? That somehow the subject must recognize authority. And seems often to forget about the kinds of recognition practices that go on the authority side of that relationship. And again, and in particular, once we look at the more robust ideas of recognition, we see that it operates on both sides. So the idea is that even to claim authority involves a kind of recognition by the authority, not only that they are standing in some kind of position or making some claim in respect of some other person, but that it's a claim to authority, which recognizes the very sort of practice of subjection and the very practice of authority that they are appealing to or are effectively wielding. So then recognition operates on both sides of the relation and also is sort of multi-directional in that it involves self-recognition as well as recognition of the other. That is the other party or the other role as occurs in the authority-subject relationship. And then thirdly, a distinction which is really more about scope of the paper as opposed to a substantive distinction. But it's very important to me that this particular paper is dealing only with recognition's structural contribution to a theory of authority. So it's not engaging the full, rich, substantive accounts of recognition, which use some idea of recognition itself to calibrate what morality requires between persons. So, for example, a lot of work, particularly work in critical political theory, will argue that persons are entitled to certain kinds of treatment as a matter of recognition, and that their struggles for recognition, as Honnett puts it, or the sort of forms that social and political and legal institutions offer recognition through are themselves matters of sort of substantive justice or substantive distribution and so on. Theorists who are really concerned with the substantive content of recognition as a standard of what is owed between persons then of course debate what that means and whether distribution is part of recognition or is somehow a separate substantive standard. So I'm setting those questions aside here, perhaps problematically, but for reasons of scope, although in other work, it's important to me to be able to get into those questions too. For now, what I'm doing is trying to isolate the structural contribution that recognition makes within the theory of authority. So it really is aiming to leave open for now just exactly what the content of recognition requires between persons as well as between persons and institutions. Okay, so with those three sort of key distinctions in mind then, I want to turn to some discussions that I think will be familiar, particularly to scholars like yourselves who are well versed in Razian accounts of authority. So forgive me if some of this is overly familiar. I'm going to emphasize only those bits that I want to use specifically to set up things I'm going to say a little bit later about recognition. So hopefully, even if it is familiar, it will be offered in a way that is relevant for this discussion, and perhaps offered in ways that are different from other discussions of Razian authority theory. So I'll just move my screen so I can actually see my text. So what I've called here a very familiar concept, a very familiar complexity of practical authority, tries to isolate this sort of duality that I've been already hinting at in this first setup. This idea that authority is both normative and social. And this is really captured in the key ideas sort of under the first part of this heading. So on the one hand, we understand authority in the Razian sense, and this is a sense that I certainly share, which is that authority is a normative power to change another's normative situation. That is a very straightforward position that I take directly from Raz. And the idea then is that authority is neither the direct application of reasons nor the application of coercive or influential power. So it's distinct from both those things. And in the way that Raz, I think, explains very persuasively, it is crucial to understanding authority that we do understand it as being distinct from coercion and from influence. And this is, of course, is a point made by Arendt and made by many others in the literature. But Raz's particular way of doing that is by explaining this normative power to change another's situation. What that, of course, means, though, is that we also have to understand it as a social or an interpersonal practice in which what's going on is not just that the normative situation is changed, it is that one is changing another's normative situation. So there are parties on both sides of some kind of relation or some kind of positional situation of authority and subject. And these two elements together mean that that the idea of authority features not only normativity, it's not only about reasons and reason giving and affecting reasons, but it's about affecting reasons within some kind of positional relationship of authority and subject. So that's the sort of first and overarching duality that I think both the idea of authority but also the justification of authority has to attend. And then there are other sort of elements which are also sort of familiar complexities of authority, but which also go directly to the significance of recognition. On the one hand, you've got the idea that authority does affect reasons, right? It does something to the subject's reasons, and yet it operates through the will of its claimant and on the will of its recipient. So there is some kind of duality there about not only what reasons there are, but also about what choices are made and how the exercise of will sits in some sort of uncomfortable or at least untidy relationship to the operation of those reasons, or rather to the affecting of those reasons. Thirdly, a complexity of authority, which I sometimes sort of have been challenged on in the past, is the idea that authority, to be operative as authority, must be both claimed and received as authority. And this points quite directly to the idea of recognition that I'm getting to, which is that when this normative power to change another's normative situation is claimed, and when it is received by a subject, it must be claimed and received as the thing that it is. That is, it can't be claimed as authority, but then received by the subject as something else. So there must be a match, or there must be a symmetry in what is claimed and what is received. I'm not going to fully defend that for now, but that might be a point that we come back to later on in discussion. And then lastly, a point which I've sort of already hinted at, which is that authority is both a power and a position. That is, it is a normative power to change another's normative situation, but it's also a positional relationship, or at least it involves a positional relationship. Okay, so if we understand authority then to have this complex sort of duality going on, then the question which I've sort of raised here and which others have raised is whether what's really going on here are two different objects of justification. On the one hand, a position of authority, on the other hand, a power of authority. Or to put it differently, are there two different and contending elements of authority? On the one hand, the social element, or perhaps this relational element as it's often called, and on the other hand, the reasons element or the normative element. If they're separate things, then we could have contending justifications for them. And indeed, that's what we often see in the literature, where you do see some proponents of relational theories of authority challenging Raz on the basis that his is a reasons focused or reasons sort of fundamental account. But there is another possibility, which is that actually this is one complex object that needs a justification that brings the elements together, rather than treating them as contending or alternative accounts of what justifies authority. And that indeed is my answer, which is that in order to understand authority as being distinct from mere practices of power or mere practices of influential or coercive power rather than normative power, and being distinct from the direct application of reasons, then you need both of these elements in there. And so a justification needs to attend to both. Okay, so in that case, then, if we accept for now with me and with other theorists who have argued for this sort of complexity of authority, then the question is, well, what justifies authority? Can we have some kind of conjunctive justification which treats both of these two elements together, or are we going to find that one is going to collapse into the other? And this is really where the most sophisticated work happens, I think, in and around authority theory. So on the one hand, you have justifications that point straight to the standards that authority must meet if it is to be justified. On the other hand, you have justifications that point to the standing that an authority must have if it is to be justified. The former case is about reasons and normativity and substance. The second set of justifications is about positional roles or relationships, and very often about the processes through which they get through which they are achieved, and then through which authority gets justified. So both standing and standards then are often put forward as alternative and contending justifications. And we see this especially in what's often known as the standing objection to Raz's service conception of authority, where the objection just effectively is a mind your own business type objection. And in this mind your own business objection, the concern is that it's all very well for, say, a Razian justification to posit that an authority is justified if it can, or normally justified if it can better help a subject conform to reasons that apply to her by following authority rather than acting independently. But that fails to actually justify making the claim to authority in the first place. That is, it's all very well to say when it would be good for someone to have authority, but that the Razian account doesn't actually explain what would justify someone claiming it in the first place, or being in a justified position to claim authority. And this again is well treated in the literature, and I don't want to say too much more about that, other than to indicate that the concern is that Raz's authority account seems to require a solution to the problem of standing, and his own arguments that are found in what's now often called the independence condition of Raz's sort of service conception of authority don't actually suffice. And there are a number of reasons which have got sort of gone into in the paper, but which aren't particularly relevant for the purposes of the recognition studies. So I'm going to set them aside, at least for the purpose of presentation. But again, something that we could return to. Okay, so the concern that does matter for my recognition work here is that it's all very well for me to posit that authority has these dual elements, and that maybe rather than having contending or alternative justifications which direct themselves to standing on the one hand and standards on the other hand, maybe we could just put them together. But the concern is that in doing so and trying to put them together, it seems like we're going to start collapsing one into the other. So, for example, if we put standards and standing together, are we going to end up saying that our standards really just are matters of reasons, and our standing, that our standing is not just a matter of relations, but really is a matter of the reasons that are relevant or valuable about those relations. And so it all effectively comes back to a matter of just reasons and isn't really a separate element at all. So what I argue in the paper when I tease sort of through this work is that to avoid any kind of redundancies, or to avoid an account which just reduces relations or the standing of authority into reasons alongside all the other kinds of reasons that are relevant to the justification of authority, we have to see them as doing different and separate work in that justification. So we have, if you like, separateness of reasons and relations, or standards and standing, but we also have their adherence. So separateness is not enough. We have to somehow be able to put them together. What I then do in the paper is argue for a bit of careful attention to two ways in which standing can be generated. One is through roles of authority, and the other is through relations of authority. In the paper, I sort of tease out the actual terminology in a bit more detail. The idea is that roles of authority, as have been articulated by the likes of Hershowitz and others, are justified institutionalized practices of authority. Right? So where there are such justified institutionalized practices, then there can be the standing of authority, then there can be a role of authority. And that contrasts with relations of authority, which are interpersonal. So the contrast then is between the collective institutionalized social practice of a role versus the direct interpersonal practice of a relation. Sometimes I think these differences get overlooked. Sometimes they are overplayed, but for my purposes, what I'm going to end up arguing is that recognition, although it looks different in the collective institutional role sense from how it looks in the direct interpersonal relation sense, ends up having the same structural impact within an account of authority. That is, what it does is operate so as to connect the authority and the subject, either within their roles or in their direct interpersonal relationships. So for my purposes, many of the differences between roles and relations of authority that are actually, I think, very significant in and of themselves are not so significant, at least for now. Okay, so the second thing that I think we learn by sort of trying to understand how reasons and relations can adhere as elements of authority, and how a justification can attend to both without collapsing one into the other, is that it forces us to look more carefully at the kinds of reasons that are actually at stake, or the kinds of reasons that are in play. So a Razian accountable authority, as is well known, really focuses and fixates on the subject's reasons for action. That is, authority is normally justified when it helps the subject better conform to the reasons for action that she had independently of the authority. But there are obviously other kinds of reasons in play, and this is true in Raz's account, and it's true in others' accounts as well. So one of the distinctions that I think is really highlighted by attending to both the practice of roles and the practices of relations of authority is that there are reasons that pertain not to the subject's action, but that pertain instead to how the subject decides what to do, or how the subject ought to decide what to do. That is, should the subject decide how to act by following authority or by acting independently. And these I call reasons for decision. And we can find reasons for decision that support the existence of roles of authority. And we can also find reasons for decision that permit the existence of interpersonal relations of authority, even in the absence of justified social roles of authority. And again, I don't want to get sort of too much further into this for the purposes of the presentation, because recognition is structurally going to have the same impact in both cases. But in the paper, I discuss how these two different pathways to supporting the standing of authority, and to justifying the claim to authority that is made can sort of can come apart. That is, that there can be justified roles of authority, which makes it really straightforward, but there can also be space in the middle where there aren't justified roles of authority, and yet there is nevertheless space within which persons can effectively form their own interpersonal authority relationships with one another in a bilateral, mutual way. And really importantly, this sort of category of reasons for decision, which are about how to decide what to do, are not only the subject's reasons, they are also reasons that apply to the authority. And so once we attend to the full package of reasons that exist in both roles and relations of authority, we see not only diversity in the kinds of reasons, but also we see how it's not only the subject reasons that are at stake, and that the full account of authority needs somehow to note that there are reasons on the authority side as well. And then our question is, what do we do with these reasons on both sides? How do they relate to one another? Are they simply separate? Or is there something that brings them together? And that's where recognition comes in. So I then just moving into point 3 then, I have a sort of a summary metaphor that I started using early on in the project, and many times have questioned whether I should keep running with it because metaphors can get run out and overrun very quickly. But I've persisted with it, which is this idea that recognition operates as a cog, and that what it does is transmits normativity and sociality. Okay, so what this means, as sort of explained in the paper, is that if we have these reasons on both sides, if there are reasons applying to the authority and reasons applying to the subject, our question really is about their relationship to one another. That is, the relationship of the reasons, understood in light of the relationship of the parties. So I argue then that what recognition does is enable a connection between both the parties and their reasons. So it connects the subject's reasons and gives the authority reason to care about those subjects' reasons. That is, it makes the subject's business also the authority's business. And on the other hand, it means that only the subject's business that is relevant to the authority role or the authority relationship in which they stand, which is relevant to the authority subject role or the authority subject relationship in which they stand, are matters on which the authority can justifiably intervene. So it's not the case that an authority can just claim to wield this normative power willy-nilly or in respect of any matters at all. Rather, their claim to authority is justified only in respect of reasons that go to the nature of the subject's subjection. So there's an element of recognition of what it is to be a subject, as well as the actual practice of subjection. And an authority who claims to wield a power without recognizing that richer, more robust sort of sense of what it is to be a subject, misrecognizes both themselves and, of course, the person subject to their power. So that's just sort of one part of the story, if you like, because the other part of the story is about what happens on the subject side and how it is that they receive authority. The sort of basic, if you like, end claim is that the subject must also be able to recognize the authority as an authority. Otherwise, they will feel its effects as being merely forceful or merely persuasive in ways that actually interfere with what would otherwise be a justified role or a justified relation of authority. So this comes back to what I said earlier about the need for symmetry and match between what is claimed and what is received. And work on recognition, particularly work that deals with matters of reciprocity of recognition or mutuality of recognition, has very tidy ways of sort of insisting that for recognition to count as such, or for recognition to to have normative effect as a response to value, then it must somehow operate as a mutual practice, albeit one which can have sort of like asymmetrical content on both sides. Again, that's something I'm not going to have time to get sort of all the way into, but something that we might want to return to in questions and answer and in question and discussion. So recognition then understood as a kind of a cog has a built-in capacity to draw together authority's normativity and its social element. And it does so because recognition itself is a practice of value. Recognition itself has these inbuilt, or it has its own inbuilt duality. And so when we treat the idea of authority as being rich in recognition, we're actually incorporating or borrowing, if you like, recognition's own capacity to sort of run these two elements together and to entwine these two elements together. So my argument then really is that this is not only a sort of a crucial element to make sense of how authority can be both normative and social, but really that it is essential to understanding how it is that authority operates at all, and certainly is necessary to understanding what its justification might be. As I said, this leaves open the full account of what substantively recognition might require between persons. And for that, we'd have to have a different paper and a different session, but that again, perhaps it's something that people want to explore in discussion. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this great presentation.